Well, another week, another flood of federal policy favoring big business and the super rich. Everyday people? Not so much. My name is Malcolm McCallum. For more than 35 years, I have studied how economics, public policy, society, and the natural world interact. These are socio-ecological systems, and the decisions made within them can strengthen communities, economies, and ecosystems, or weaken them. In this series, I examine federal policy to determine who benefits, who assumes risk, and where those decisions are taking us. This week, the Federal Register published 595 documents. Most were administrative or procedural, but 233 represented substantial policy actions. I looked at those actions in a way that goes beyond asking whether the regulation is simply pro-business, pro-worker, or pro-environment. For every substantial action, I asked two independent questions. Who does the public policy help or empower? And who does it place at risk of disadvantage or at disadvantage? Sometimes a group had both advantages and disadvantages coming from a particular policy. I then compared the results with the previous weekly review that I published last week. I examined what the 2-week pattern suggests, checked Congressional Review Act activity, and counted which elected officials actually spoke for or against these policies each week. The August 7th through 14th report analyzed 580 Federal Register documents and classified 218 substantial documents. The current week, therefore, contains both a slightly larger total volume and a larger substantial share. So who benefited and who was put at risk? Okay. When we look at these different documents that were published, big business and large corporations benefited. Only they benefited in 75 of the actual documents. They were at risk in 35, and they had in 28 of the policies. They received both risks and benefits from those policies. So, roughly 44% had any benefit to big businesses, and 27% had any risk to big businesses. Compare this to small business, in which 10.7% of the policies provided any benefit at all of any kind, even overlapping with big business, at only 10.7% of the policies, while 7.3% of the policies definitely had some form of risk. Workers and employees gained benefits from roughly 27% of policies, but they also received risks, were put at risk by roughly 16% of policies. Farmers and ranchers, they largely were afterthoughts, with only 8.2% receiving any benefit, largely from overlap with those other sectors, and 6% received risks, kind of canceling out any benefits they got. Retirees and pensioners, well, only 0.4% of the policies had any benefit to people who were retired. But on the plus side, none of them really had placed them at any particular significant risk. So that kind of cancels out again, because one policy out of over 200 some odd policies really doesn't mean much. The environment did gain roughly 13%. Roughly 13% of the policies benefited the environment and conservation. However, 16% actually placed the environment at risk. And like with many of these policies, the degree of benefit and the degree of risk is not being assessed in here. I'm not doing that, but the truth is that it can in some cases be much worse because the benefits could be so much better or worse than the risks in any one of these categories that this isn't the total big picture. But it does give us a kind of an idea. Numbers of policies do translate into the degree of support generally. Consumers benefited from roughly 30% of the policies, but they also were placed at risk in almost 20% of the policies, leaving a net 10% gain. Low income and social benefit dependent peoples, the disabled, people out of work, people who are just not making much money, they received benefits from roughly 0.5% of policies that were pumped out this week, but they also were placed at risk by almost 2% of the policies. 4 times as many policies went against the low income and socially disadvantaged as helped them. Students in education pretty much canceled out, with 1.7% of policies benefiting and 1.3% placing them at risk. State, local, and tribal governments benefited from roughly 19% of policies, while being placed at risk by just barely to almost 2%. Developers, landowners, and extractive interests, things like, building massive buildings and things of that nature, and also oil drilling, they benefited from roughly 14% of the policies, but were placed at risk by roughly 7%. So basically, policies benefited these individuals at a 2-to-1 ratio. And then the interests of civil rights and our own personal protections to the individual, things that protect you from the government. Only 5.6% of policies that were issued this week benefited your personal rights, while 5.2% placed them at risk. These two areas actually cancel out, meaning that we can largely say that there was no net benefit of any of the sum total of policies passed this week to your individual rights as a citizen of the United States. Now, when we look at this and we compare this back to last week, big business, the benefit was almost an 18% gain, and the risk was a 4.5% gain for big business. It was strong. There was a strong net benefit to big business over the last 2 weeks, but also the most frequently regulated or economically exposed sector as well. Small business, which actually accounts for 55 to 60% of combined with the self-employed, actually accounts for 55 to 60 some odd percent of all the jobs in the country. There was no opportunity is positive in here, but small firms repeatedly appear on both sides of the ledger, gaining benefits or risks, because the rules helped one industry while raising costs for another. So it really is a kind of a mix. And if we just isolate on the self-employed and independent contractors, there were very mixed results from the policies. The actual, when we look at things like fisheries contracting and marketing access rules, these things create both opportunities and exposures, so they kind of canceled out again. So the self-employed and independent operators over the last 2 weeks really didn't gain or lose much of anything. They're just sort of stagnant, kind of like the economy. Workers and employees, there were more worker-relevant policies overall, and safety and employment benefits coexisted with staffing and trade and contractor policy risks. The net benefit was a 23% gain, but also the risks were at an 11% gain over what they were before. And considering the employment climate that we're in, or at least a perceived one, that's probably of concern to a lot of people. Farmers and ranchers got a net positive opportunity, but pesticide, market, land use, and ecological risks mean agriculture cannot be treated as a benefit-only sector. In fact, they did receive 5.4% of the policies gave them benefits, but at the same, a net 5.4% gain over last week, but they also had a 6% gain in risks from last week, so it actually got worse for farmers and ranchers. Kind of a disappointment considering the situation with farming economies in this country right now. Retirees and pensioners largely had no real change. Their footprint's still the same as it was. The environment and conservation, there's still a persistent risk-leaning pattern. The more conservation actions than the prior week, yet development, deregulation exposures remain immense. And so they were still losers this week. Consumers did get a net benefit because 23% of the policies benefited consumers. However, 13% placed them at risk, so we're not talking about a huge gain there. And that's, I said that wrong. That's a net benefit over last week. Basically, meaningful price, product safety, financial and exposure risks are still there, and nothing really has been done about them. Patients in public health, they had a net benefit gain of roughly 5 points. However, they also had a gain of 3 points for risk, so this kind of canceled out. No real improvements for people who are dealing with medical issues, people and our health care and public health in general. Low income and social benefits dependent people, they also largely had no net gain since last week. Students and education in general, same. State, local, and tribal governments, they did gain a little bit with an 8% improvement in regard to policies that benefited them, and they only had about 1% that placed them at risk, so this was a net gain for state, local, and tribal governments. One of the clearest net benefit constituencies across both weeks, with limited but real federalism compliance risks for these different government groups. Developers, landowners, and extractive interests, things like mining, oil wells, and building big buildings, they had a net gain of 4.1% of the policies, but they also had a 2.3% gain in risky policies for them. They had a consistent net benefit of access, permitting, and deregulatory actions. Environmental and compliance constraints are the main counterweight. They cut environmental regulations, which protect everyday people in the natural environment, so that these groups would be able to benefit. When we talk about our individual rights as people, 4.7% of the policies benefited us, but only 4.7% of policies. There was a net gain of 4.7% of policies over last week, and that benefited you. But there were also about a 1% gain. There was 1% more policies that placed you at risk. This is highly contested, and it's definitely mixed. The 2-week direction is less about simple gains and losses for civil rights and your individual rights as people, and it's much more about which rights and the enforcement mechanisms and that federal policy emphasizes. When we look at the big business and large corporations in the current week, large businesses appear in 103 of the 233 substantial actions, which is roughly 44% on the benefits side, and 22% on the risk side, 27% on the risk side. 28 actions place it on both ledgers, meaning that that big business both received from particular policies, benefits, and risks. Trade remedies, aviation, industrial safety, securities regulations, and sector-specific compliance are major reasons for the large risk footprint. Compared to the prior week, the benefit footprint rose from 26.1% of policies to 44% of policies for big business and the mega rich, because that's who pretty much owns these, while risk to these same sectors rose from 22 to 27%, which isn't actually much of a change. The current week is therefore much more large business relevant overall, but not simply pro-corporate. Over the last 2 weeks, we can say that large business is the clearest recurring beneficiary of federal policy, while also being one of the most frequently regulated or economically exposed constituencies. And I'll just continue on. When we look at small business, it appears in 68 actions, roughly 30%. It is in 68 actions, or roughly 30%. It's on the benefit side of the spectrum, and 40 of the actions that were released over this week, or roughly 17%, were on the risk side. 38 actions actually had both risks and benefits in them. This often means different small businesses occupy opposite positions of the same rule. And so it's kind of a mixed situation again. Compared to the prior week showed 13.8% benefit and 9.6% risk. Both footprints expand sharply this week. So there's a lot more policies that are bad and good for small businesses, depending on what sector of small business you're actually in. Over the 2 weeks that I've assessed so far, small business has been a net beneficiary overall, but sector-specific trade, safety, fisheries, and compliance measures make the category much more mixed than a simple small business relief label implies. I guess another way to say this is just plain, small business wasn't like super helped by any of this stuff, but it wasn't super hurt either, unlike big business. The self-employed and independent contractors, when we look at them, they appear in 25 actions where they gain benefits, just about 11%, 10 or 11%. But 17, roughly 7%, garnered, actually elicited risk to small businesses, to self-employed and independent contracts. There were also 15 actions that gave both benefits and risks, and again, that was depending on where you are in the spectrum. Maybe the action helped some small businesses and hurt others. Compared with the prior week, this is pretty much flat. There was a little bit of risk rise, and the benefits pretty much stayed the same. So small businesses are a tiny bit worse off they're at a tiny bit more risk due to federal policy this week than they had been ending last week. Workers and employees, they appeared as beneficiaries of 64 actions, which is roughly 27 to 28% of all the policies, all of the substantial policies that were released, while 15% or 36 they gained risk. 26 of the actions also provided risk and benefits depending on where in the economy you operated as a worker or employee. Safety directives, workforce services, contractor employment rules, and trade actions all contributed to this. Compared with the prior week, this is one of the largest shifts from the prior review. Benefit rises from 4.6% to 27.5%, and risk from 4.1% to 15.5%. So across both weeks, last week, 2 weeks ago and this past week, worker impacts are increasingly central. The overall direction is modestly positive, but staffing changes, contractor policy changes, and trade effects create substantial countervailing exposure. What this basically means is that even though there are more policies to help out workers and employees, something that's classically called labor, when compared to something like benefits for corporate America, it really doesn't stack up. Farmers and ranchers, they appear in 19 policies as beneficiaries. So they got benefits from roughly 8% of the policies that were passed, and they also gained 6% of policies which gave more risk to the farmers. So effectively, there was no net gain. There was no help. When you elicit 8% of policies helping and 6% hurting, it all kinds of cancels out. They also had 13 other actions where farmers might be both a benefit, might gain benefits and risk from it. And this includes stuff like reducing the doing something that while you might gain a little more income, your health might be more damaged, or you may gain health benefits but you lose income, or you might be able to sell your corn for more. You might be better able to sell your corn, but you're not going to make as much money off it. Now, those are fabricated examples. That's not a subject of any of these policies. I just wanted to point out what kind of things might be in there, how that might work. Compared to the prior week, the prior review showed 2.8% benefit footprint and essentially no risk. The current reevaluation reveals a much more realistic two-side agriculture picture, and really, it hasn't been a win for farmers at all. Effectively mirrored when we look at retirees and pensioners. If you're retired, nothing really happened that's helping you. 1.4% of policies benefited you. None really gave you any risk. And compared to last week, it's kind of the same thing. Retirees are not a major target of this administration's policies over the last 2 weeks. You're dealing with increased inflation and all those things, but nothing's really being done. From an environment and conservation perspective, it appeared in 31 actions where it actually was the benefit. Oftentimes these were just things like, we're having an environmental impact statement done. And so in that case, just because, how are they performing it? Are they following the rules, or are they going to stack the deck? And both of these things can be done. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just saying that, and this goes for, and that's the problem with this particular category. Sometimes things get classified as a benefit, but they're only a benefit if they're done correctly, following the policies to ensure that everything's being objective. If you stack the deck, they don't work properly. So, compared with the last week, There was a positive environmental activity rise from 2.8 to 13%, but the risk also rose from 11 to 16%. So the net gain, there is no positive impact of the policies this week because we still have more risk to the environment than we had before. And a lot of these positives were simply implementing actions like doing a risk assessment or evaluating things. And who's evaluating them and how are they evaluating them is a question. The 2-week assessment, if we combine both the weeks for environment and conservation, across both weeks the environmental picture remains risk-leaning. It's definitely more risky. And the current week is more active on conservation than the prior one, but the larger development deregulation footprint keeps the cumulative posture net negative. The bottom line is there's lots of policies and deregulation that protect the environment. And remember that when we say environment here, we're not talking about just the natural world. The environment is all of that, those things, those networks that support people in their social and in your cities and so forth as well. Can you get to work? Can you get to church? How much are you paying for food? All that stuff is part of the environment. Has someone parked a toxic waste dump next to your house? You know, things it just, that's exaggerated because that probably isn't going to happen, but anyway. Looking at consumers, the current week, consumers appeared in 72 actions, or roughly 31%, where they gained benefits. And 46 of the policies, or about roughly 20%, elicited risks to consumers. And then there were 25 actions that provided both benefits and risks. Product safety, market competition, financial rules, food and pesticide decisions, and trade policies all matter here. Consumers really didn't benefit that much at the end of the day. Compared with the prior week, it was more beneficial by a lot. But the risk was also a lot higher. We're talking about benefits rose from 8 to 30% of policies. However, policies that hurt consumers rose to 20% from last week where it was only 6. This is one of the strongest expansions in policy exposure across all of these different areas. Consumers were definitely hurt. Meanwhile, billionaires benefited. When we look at patients, people who are going to the physician and the public health in general, 32 actions, or roughly 14% of the policy actions benefited these individuals, while only 10% placed risk at these. There were also that were entirely risk eliciting. There were about 10% of the policies that were posted this week provided risk to public health. There were also 5 though that gave some risks and some benefits. Health-related rules often accept residual risk while producing a larger expected benefit. So that's not really completely unexpected, but this was kind of a net gain of nothing. For everything they did that helped public health, they did something that hurt it. Again, this seems to be a pattern across many of these categories. It's just kind of there's no good that doesn't accompany bad. Compared with last week, the benefits were basically the same, and that's about all you can say. The 2-week assessment, when we look at both weeks combined, across both weeks, public health was moderatively positive, but it was pretty mixed in the policies. Safety and access measures outweigh risk, but pesticide exposure, due to opening up certain pesticides that are definitely not good to be around, and also restrictions placed on different policies that cover health in general, medical policies, and definitely weaken safeguards remain really big risks to patients and public health. When we look at people who are unemployed, and low income and dependent on social benefits, only one action that they did this week had any clear benefit, while 4 created material risks. One action actually both gave risks and benefits. Compared with the prior week, both footprints are smaller than what was there last week, but the direction remains unfavorable. If you're someone who's low income, depending on social benefits, or you're unemployed, you are not being helped by the administration. You have not been helped by the administration these past 2 weeks at all. If you're a student or someone involved in education, students in education appear in 4 different policy actions, only about 2% of all the actions that were out there, where they were beneficial. And 3 actions were risk bearers. 2 actions actually bore risk and benefits. Accreditation reform is the clearest dual effect case because accreditation, while it changes to accreditation are massive. If you're a student going to a school, your school loses accreditation. That can be a bad thing. However, if your school has an impeccable reputation, accreditation means nothing. There are some schools that have lost accreditation for various reasons and had no impact on anything. And accreditation doesn't mean what a lot of people think it does. There's this idea. It's just not what everybody think it is. I don't want to get off on a tangent. Compared with the prior week, the percentages are only slightly above. I mean, it's basically the same. Nothing special's happened for education, and there have been some risks, but they all kind of cancel out. When we look at state, local, and tribal governments, they appear in 43 actions, or roughly 19% of all, as beneficiaries, and there were only 4, roughly 2%, that bore risk. So they definitely were helped this week. Some of these things were just the opening up of grants and disaster aid, delegated discretion, and staffing flexibilities. These are things that dominate helping these groups out and hurting them, depending on what the action was. Last week, there were about 10% of policies benefited. This week, almost roughly 19%. So they benefited a lot more this week than last, and they didn't really gain in risk at all. It's been pretty low over the 2 weeks. This is one of the clearest net benefited constituencies. They definitely did do a lot more for state, local, and tribal governments than they hurt them. Developers, landowners, and oil drillers and miners, things like that, they're kind of a big lumped category. They appear in 33 actions, or roughly 14%, as beneficiaries, and roughly 7% gave them risk, or as I said before, a 2-to-1 ratio of beneficial actions to risky actions. Compared with the prior week, the actual ratio isn't that much different, but there was twice as many benefits provided. Over the last 2 weeks, the category remains consistent net beneficiary on a 2-to-1 ratio. For every policy action that hurts these groups, to benefit them. And this probably isn't a surprise when your president's main industry falls into development and landowning. So, I mean, and many of the people in the administration fall into these categories as well. When we look at rights for the individual, rights to your personal protection of your personal rights, that appeared in 13 actions as the beneficiary, and 12 as on the risk side. So they pretty much for every beneficial action they made a risky act, something that didn't benefit you. some of these were due to regulatory changes that benefited big business, and some were from removing a contractor-specific civil rights enforcement mechanism that protected workers. Compared to last week, this was a roughly 5% increase in benefits, but only about a 1% increase in risks. So they did provide more benefits this week, but they didn't really change. They were still pumping out the same number of derogatory policies. So when we sort of look at this in a much more general perspective, and we score this like I have before, what does it all add up to? Well, if we ask, did policies this week support jobs and economic activity, it's basically a 3 out of 5. For this week, it was roughly 3 out of 5 last week. There really isn't any big change. Do these policies during the current week, have they improved? Are they targeting improving inflation, lowering inflation and cost pressures? Well, actually, no. They're actually, last week I scored it at a 3. This week it's at 2.8. So we can just round that off to a 3. They're really not helping inflation over the last 2 weeks, and from an environmental perspective, they are devastating the environment. When we talk about the major policy actions and what they do, who they help, and who bears the risk, well, I could go over each of the individual policies, but some of these have already been touched on, shorts and so forth, so I'm not going to go over all of these. There was a crypto asset rule that was passed, which I didn't mention, and it seems to help crypto issuers and startups and things like that, while the investors bear the risk. This is an interesting policy to me, considering that we do have major political figures who are crypto issuers, and the fact that this policy places investors at risk and benefits issuers is it's not really the kind of thing you like to see. But that's up for comments. It's not actually a policy. So we have a number of things that have come up. Some of these I'll still have to review. And I think that's pretty much it. I almost forgot. Okay. So when I forgot to go over the Congressional Review Act audit. So how many with all of these things that were just plain not helping inflation, were devastating the environment, not helping workers, not helping the retirees, and pretty much the only group that really helped were big business and oil drillers and land developers. We probably should ask, what is Congress has an actual responsibility by the Constitution to provide oversight over actions conducted by the executive branch, specifically when new policies are being released. So if we look at this, it's amazing. Okay? When we look at the actual number of Senate, House representatives, and we only had 3 actual comments here in regard to the. Wait a second here. I think I just mixed something up. The roadless rule decision. We did have an actual Congressional Review Act audit done on Bears Ears. So they did do that, and that was, but the thing about the Congressional Review Act is really an interesting one. Only a politician would make a law like this. If you're against a policy action, you can say you are against it. If you are for it, you don't have to say you're for it. So what that provides for a congressman is plausible deniability. Oh, well, I didn't actually make any statement on that policy. Well, I hate to say it, but in my book, no action is support in this case, in my opinion. Either you support the action or you don't support the action. Now, you may have no opinion, and that falls in there too. But it would be good if Congress started doing their job and actually reviewing these policies and making public statements for the voters to know. It's not that hard. If I could go over these by myself with no support and just little old me by myself, and I can get through 218 things while having a full-time job, I'm sure that somehow a senator or a House of Representative with a team of researchers and politicians supporting them can get through those 218 policy changes. Okay? I'm sure they can find the time. Just don't grandstand on some program for an hour. Move right along. So from a takeaway here, this week's Federal Register was more policy dense than the previous review. And in fact, this one took quite a little bit longer to go over. It affected a much broader range of economic sectors. Large business was still a big winner. But consumers, workers, small business, and states, they had far more substantial actions. But were they really winners? Not compared to the big mega corporations and oil drillers and so forth. The key lesson is that these are not clean winners and losers for any category. Okay, farmers can gain a pesticide tool while bearing exposure risk and market risk that comes with it. If you're allowed to use a pesticide on your crop and your crop is no longer eligible for import into another country, well, it didn't help you, did it? Workers can gain from safety rules while other workers can lose from staffing or trade changes. Consumers can gain from competition and supply while accepting price, financial, or health risks. Environmentally, the week was more active on conservation than the previous one, but cumulative direction still leans toward a very negative climate for conservation, which is a shame because conservation issues preserve or conserve. Those are different things. Conserve is wise use. Preserve is no use. No use as far as consumption. A lot of the things that fall under conservations are things that can't be replaced once they're gone. Politically, almost all of the visible elected officials' attention focused on one issue, and that was repeal of the roadless rule. And although Congressional Review Act of the Government Accounting Office also opened another path for Congress to challenge federal land management policy at Bears Ears, but other than that, that was pretty much it. And it's hard to believe that you can have 218 policy changes that are substantial, and Congress can't find the time to say much about any of them except for two. The Federal Register is not one policy. It is hundreds of decisions moving at once. Over these two reviews, the strongest recurring pattern is broad support for big business and development and state and local flexibility, paired with substantial trade, safety, civil rights, and environmental risks. Looking only for winners misses half the story. The better question is who is being advanced and who is assuming risk, and what kind of federal policy system is emerging when we put those decisions together. Today's decisions push forward corporations, mega rich, the most powerful of the powerful, while the everyday guy, not so much. That's it for today. This is a long video. Please consider watching some of my other videos. I'll have another review for the week next week. In the meantime, I'll post many shorts that target individual little snippets of this or other policies, and I'll also almost inevitably review one or two or maybe a few more larger policy reviews that are selected in general sectors. Have a nice day, and I'm very please consider subscribing. I'm the only person in this entire operation, and nobody's bought me off to say nice things or not. In fact, I looked up my channel on Google, and Google said I was completely unpartisan. I do have some biases because everybody does, but I was proud to say I was nonpartisan in my reviews, and I'm sure this one is as well. You have a very nice day.